Today, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Larry Randall Ray. Dr. Ray is a professor of economics at Bard College and senior scholar at the Levy Economics Institute. He was a Fulbright scholar and previously a professor at the University of Missouri and the University of Denver. He is one of the developers of modern money theory, MMT, a heterodox view of economics that argues sovereign governments with their own currencies can never go bankrupt or run out of money. The restraint on spending is limited by the availability of physical resources, technological capability, and political will. Dr. Ray, so wonderful for you to join us. I'm really, really excited to, you read and you see and you hear sound bites about modern money or modern monetary theory, but to really talk to somebody who, one of the folks who really came up with the idea is a great privilege. So thank you for your time. First question, is it modern money theory or modern monetary theory, or are they sort of interchangeable?
Well, they're interchangeable. So, usually we say MMT. I much prefer modern money theory because it puts the emphasis on money. It's a theory of money. Some people prefer modern monetary theory, but I'm always worried a little bit that people will say, "Oh, this is just a different version of monetarism. They must be like Milton Friedman or something." And of course, we're not at all. So I prefer to use the term money.
Let's do modern money theory and get that instead, since you are a certainly a thought leader in the space. You arguably came up with some of the ideas, so let's use that. So for my edification as well as for to help our watchers and our readers, can you give us the basic structure of modern money theory?
Well, what we try to do is understand the difference between a currency issuer, and we can talk about what that means, versus a currency user, and argue that the kinds of constraints that households and firms and local governments face in terms of getting hold of money that they can use for purchasing power, those things don't apply to the national government. Our national government chooses the money of account. So in the United States, it's called the dollar. In Britain, it's called the pound. This is chosen by the national government. The national government imposes liabilities. Taxes are the biggest one, liabilities on us. And it denominates all of those in dollars too. National governments, they've chosen the money of account. They also issued the currency. And, in America, we're used to the paper notes and the coins. If we go back in history, we'll find that they used other things. Um, and those used to be a really significant portion of the money supply. Today, they're not. Okay. So things have changed a bit, and we can get into does that make any difference or not? But in the old days, the government would actually issue the paper notes when it spent. Now today, probably no one listening to us has ever paid their taxes using currency. Now you could get your wheelbarrow, you could push it to the treasury, and you say, "Here, I've got all these notes. I want to pay my taxes." Nobody does that anymore. And the US government very rarely ever spends currency. It spent currency in Iraq. It spends currency, in wartime when overseas, but it doesn't spend currency in the US. So it's there. There are some degrees of separation between us and our government that we used to not have. Today, we have a private bank and we have a central bank between us and the Treasury. And all spending by the US government goes through both the central bank, which we call the Fed, and the private bank, your bank, whatever it happens to be. And all tax payments reverse that. They go through your private bank and through the central bank before the Treasury receives your tax revenue. Okay. Um, but these are it's important to understand how all this works, but it didn't really change the nature of the way that the government spends.
I think the point you made early on was the way we should think about a government and sort of a family or a private company is because the government issues their own money and could be, as I remember my high school economics teacher says, they could always run the presses, although they wouldn't necessarily, they would create more money today with numbers rather, putting a credit into your account, like the helicopter drop of money, as Bernanke, I think, once put it, much more efficiently and effectively, or certainly more easily than if they, if they were to try to pass around coins and even paper money. Now, why is it that, is it simply because the government can run the presses or can credit as many accounts with as much as possible, make it that they can never go bankrupt?
Okay, so in the old days, you're printing up money, and as long as there's paper, there was no limit. Okay, as long as someone out there wanted a US dollar bill, the government could spend the dollar bill. Okay, now if nobody had anything they wanted to sell to the government and nobody had any more taxes they needed to pay, that would be the limit. But see, that limit is a real resource limit. Nobody wants to sell anything they've got to the government for dollars. The government has come up against a hard limit. It's not that it ran out of money, it ran out of people willing to sell the government something. That was the limit. And my argument is that is still true. So the government could run up against a limit. Nobody will take another dollar from the United States government. I think we're a long ways away from that. There always are people willing to sell something to the government. They can't run out. And today, as you mentioned Bernanke, Bernanke said it is all keystrokes today. All spending by the government is keystroked into existence. And as I was saying at the very beginning, the Treasury doesn't do it directly. It is the central bank, the Fed, that does those keystrokes. And this is what Bernanke was saying. It's the Fed. We keystroke that money into existence. Um, can you run out of keystrokes? No, you can't run out of a keystroke.
I want to go back to what you just said and try to get my arms around the theory a little bit better. You said that the limit is I guess sort of resources. If the government runs out of things that it can buy, then that will cause presumably inflation. I want to get to that in a second. But what is the upper limit of things that we can buy? Is it things that the United States can produce internally, or does it include things that the rest of the world makes? So things or services, I should say. So services is 70% of the economy. Does it include, is it just US GDP or does it include the world?
Well, um, of course, the rest of the world wants dollars. And we are a reserve currency issuer. We're the most important one now. It used to be the UK was the most important uh, currency issuer to the rest of the world. And so, as long as the rest of the world wants more dollars, the US government, and actually us too, as residents of the US, we can sell stuff to the rest of the world as long as they want dollars. Again, we can't run out of the dollars. Why might we exhaust the global demand for dollars? The rest of the world says, no more, don't want any more dollars. That would be the limit. Now, is there any realistic danger that we're coming close to that limit? I think the answer is clearly no. Why does Trump have to put tariffs on everybody? Because they want dollars, right? Plenty of countries, plenty of companies, plenty of people around the world want to sell stuff to the United States to get the dollars. And Trump is saying, well, if you really want them, we're going to put a tax on you. Okay.
Right.
So,
It's a tax on somebody, sort of to be
yeah.
determined in a way. Now, so the crux that we always hear about modern, money theory, or sometimes it's more often in the press. I've seen it as modern monetary theory, but I want to stick with your definition. Um, when the the only sort of limitation to that would be you're running the presses so much that you're creating potentially a lot of inflation. So how do we deal with this? And for as long as my useful professional life, which is probably 30 odd years, we were at some stage struggling to get inflation. 2012 or 2000, the Fed framework was, how do we get more inflation? But all of a sudden that inflation bogeyman, after having disappeared, seems to be back. So how do we avoid inflation if we run the presses, or run the keystroke, so to speak?
Yeah, the answer is that before the government decides to undertake some spending program, whatever it might be, um, we want to ensure that the resources are there. We want to look at the potential competition from the private sector, most likely, but also possibly from foreigners. What is the competition? And are we going to create enough of a scarcity that the price is going to go up? Now, we know the government can win every bid. The government can always win because no one can outbid the government. A private firm will go bankrupt before they could beat the government in bidding up prices. So we know the government will be able to get the resources if they're available because it can outbid anyone else. But the consequence will be higher prices. Exactly right. And less for the private sector to use, which means it'll depress the private sector. So those are the things we should worry about. And so, what we do, we have the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, and they score spending programs and also tax reductions. And how do they score them? What will the impact be on the deficit? Okay, now this is stupid. What they should be scoring it on is how much inflation will this cause? The government's going to engage in some kind of spending, subsidizing solar panels. Okay, the question is not, is that going to increase the budget deficit? No, the question is going to be, if the government is subsidizing purchases, we know that demand for solar panels is going to go up. Do we have the capacity to meet that demand without inflation? That's the only question that matters. So the scoring always should be, what's the inflation danger? Well, secondary, we'll be competing with the private sector. Do we really want to move those resources out of the private sector into the government sector? Now, what I just described is exactly what we did in World War II. In World War II, the question was never, where will the money come from? The question always was, where will the resources come from? And what is it going to do to the private sector if we take all those resources and put them in the war effort? Okay, it's going to be inflationary, but it's also going to cause scarcity in the production of consumer goods. Okay, so that's what you need to worry about. You don't worry about the deficit.
So I'm not much of an accountant. The numbers always kind of accounting classes always put me to sleep. But it seems like it's a lot easier to score the deficit versus scoring inflation. So how would one score inflation? And I guess a corollary to that is, what would be the right amount of inflation on an annual basis? So a two-part question there.
Okay. Well, first, I don't think that it's more difficult. The You notice the CBO is almost always wrong. When I don't know if you remember when Clinton had his marker pen and the whiteboard, and he used projections for the budget surplus for the next 15 years. The government was going to run a budget surplus and retire all the government debt. Okay, that's what he said. If you don't believe it, you can Google it. You can find him making this great announcement. The whole room full of elected politicians stood up and gave him a standing ovation for that prediction. Okay, now he didn't make it. Economists made that prediction for him. His house economists made that. It was amazingly wrong. Okay, we had 2.5 years of budget surplus, and then we went into a big deficit, a global financial crisis, and a deficit ever since. And of course, the debt ratio has grown to 100% of GDP. We were supposed to have eliminated all the outstanding debt by the middle of the last decade. Didn't happen. So I would not say that they do a better job of projecting the deficit and impacts on the deficit than they could do on inflation. How do you do it? Well, I'm going to say a very bad word. It starts with a P. Planning. You plan. Corporations plan. We think, well, it's okay for a corporation to plan. It's sort of a sensible thing to do. Government planning? No, government shouldn't plan anything. But that's how we did it in World War II. We planned it. Okay. You had to plan shipbuilding. You had to plan the construction of the aircraft for the war. You had to locate the resources. You had to build the plant and equipment to produce those. It required planning. Now, does that mean we plan the whole economy? No. We plan the projects that the government is going to undertake. Okay, so it's not planning the whole economy. You locate the resources. You see what resources are available, and you see, is this a plausible thing that we might be able to do? Okay, building the windmills or whatever it is.
Let's say they could, let's assume that we're going to get enough smart people from MIT or the Kennedy School, wherever it might be, or one of your graduate students from Bard College perhaps, or several of them, and they can figure out, they can sort of score it for inflation. What would be, do you think, is there a number? Can we put a number on it? Is it 2%, 3%? What's the right level of inflation on sort of an annual ongoing basis with a little bit of give either way?
Um, let me just start out. So economists have tried to uh, find the negative impacts on the economy from inflation. A very famous article from several decades ago, and they really couldn't find any negative impacts in terms of unemployment, in terms of economic growth, in terms of investment, and so on, until you get to an inflation rate of about 40% per year. You get up to 40% per year, your economy starts to hurt. Okay? This is an empirical study, it's not theoretical. This is what they found. Now, I'm not endorsing 40% inflation. What I'm saying is the economic impacts of single digit inflation and maybe low double digit inflation, you won't find negative economic impacts. Will you find political impacts? Yes, you will. And we did. Okay. The downfall of Biden was the inflation. And I don't know, maybe we hit 6 or briefly, and then we came down to around 3. And the Fed isn't happy if we're even just one tiny click above 2. Now that is completely irrational. There's no bad economic effects of a 2.5% inflation rate, a 3% inflation rate. And politically, it is not, uh, that has not been significant in the past. Now, I think that right now, uh, there is a political problem. I think the economy is not performing well enough for a huge block of Americans. And this has been going on for some time. It's not because of Trump. It's not because of Biden. It's not because of Trump 1. It's been going on at least since the global financial crisis, which we never fully recovered from, and even before that, I would say even in the 1990s, in which for maybe half of the US population, the economy is not performing well for them. So they've been suffering a long time. And what they notice, the expense that they notice is when they go to the grocery store. And what they see is, oh, that used to be $1.10 and now it's $1.30, and I'm struggling. I'm having trouble. So it is a political problem now, I think, because people are not doing well. And so
Um,
they're blaming that rather than blaming the fact that they don't have good jobs, they don't have decent pay, and lots of other parts of their budget, they're not as visible. Okay, it's in your health insurance, the amount that's taken out of your paycheck and the amount that your employer has to pay every month. That's going up rapidly. You don't notice that as much as you do the price of a gallon of gas. And so the things that are really visible, they're not going up that much, but they're very visible and people are really hurting. So that is a problem. It's a political
So,
problem.
so I don't want to be in the business of saying gotcha and have like a sexy tidbit, like the headline writers of the New York Post, who are some of the best in the business. But you said that, and I just want to take a round number so we can discuss it. That inflation in the high single digits or perhaps even the low double digits wouldn't have a tremendous economic implication, but a political problem. So if we took 10% and we said we were willing to live with 10% inflation, the argument would go then that certainly private business would start pricing in that if we have 10% inflation, then we're going to, that they will every year raise their prices by 12% or something like that. And you go into a cycle of, perhaps it is wage driven inflation, depending on how it works. But isn't, you know, is having 10% in the mind of private business and they doing that, would that be a problem as we move forward more than like a year or two?
It depends a lot on the institutional arrangements in the economy. So uh, you alluded to wages. So we will get accelerating inflation uh, if there is this struggle between profit and wages. That's how you can get accelerating inflation. Uh, in the United States, we don't have that situation. The labor unions are far too weak. And so you're not going to get a wage price spiral. So what you're describing as a wage price spiral, we're not going to get that. The reason that firms won't be able to continue to do that, raise 12% if the inflation rate is 10, and then 14% if it goes to 12, the reason they won't be able to do that is because wages are not keeping up. So I don't think that that's a plausible scenario. But I'm also not saying that we should aim for 10%. What I'm saying is the difference between 2 and 2.5 is not significant. And we could go into whether the Fed actually has any control over inflation. I'm on the side that argues that they don't.
I think I'm going to have to come and take a class with you to have time to go through that.
The other reason why I don't believe the accelerating inflation is plausible is because uh, China, India, Southeast Asia, uh, we compete with all of them. Domestic firms compete with all of them. There is just no way that American firms can raise their prices by 10% per year. They'll lose all of their customers.
Makes a
It
lot of sense.
cannot happen. It
Absolutely.
cannot happen. So
Absolutely.
that's another aspect of the institutional changes. This is not the US of the 1960s. This is the US of 2025, where China can undercut us in everything that we do. Our firms do not have pricing power. So they cannot do that.
And then the last piece I wanted to get to, and then I want to get to some more sort of general questions on how this would operate, is again a job guarantee. That part of MMT is that there's a job guarantee for everybody who is, I suppose, willing and able to work. Is that a correct characterization?
With ableness very broadly defined, because most people with disabilities want jobs, they just can't get them. So yes, people with disabilities would be included. You adapt the job to them.
So is that this job guarantee? I guess I have a couple of questions around that. Um, is that different than universal basic income, where you're basically doing a helicopter drop of money to everybody, presumably on a monthly basis?
Well, yes, the the basic income guarantee is going to cause inflation. And
Hmm.
if it's a decent sized check, it's going to cause massive inflation. Okay, we sort of saw that during COVID. We saw $5 trillion worth of checks mailed out, and we ended up with some inflation. Who would have thought that $5 trillion of checks in a pandemic that had severe supply side disruptions, who would have thought that would cause inflation? Well, we did. We said this is a bad idea. Okay, a job guarantee, you only pay the people who've been hired into the program. Okay, you don't send out checks to everyone, and they must work. And you hopefully they're going to, gain skills on the job. They're going to, if they haven't already developed a work habit, they're going to develop a work habit. They're going to become more employable. If the economy expands, the private sector can recruit workers out of the program rather than from among the unemployed. These are better potential employees because they're working. They have a work record. You know that they show up on time rather than someone who's been unemployed for 6 months. And you know that long-term unemployed remain long-term unemployed basically until they leave the labor force because no one will take a chance. It's nothing like basic income guarantee. It is a a universal job guarantee in which if you're willing to work, we will give you a job. Now, you still have to meet all of the normal work requirements, showing up on time, showing up sober, doing the job that you're supposed to do, all those things. Otherwise, you get fired. So, guarantee gives sort of a wrong impression. No, you're not guaranteed to hang on to that job no matter what you do. You can be fired.
Um, and labor force participation is somewhere a little bit south, I think, of 63%. In your view, if we put in a job guarantee, those willing and able to do that, where would you roughly think that labor force participation ought to go to?
Okay. When we did a simulation, which is going through all of the math and using an economic model called the FAIR model, which does pretty well modeling the U.S. economy. Uh, and we went through all the categories of people who are out of the labor force or working part-time but want a full-time job and so on. And I can just tell you, so for the year 2019, that was about 15 million people. Okay. So they're of normal working age. So we're not including 80-year-old people or anything like that. Normal working age who don't have a full-time job or don't have a part-time job that is the right number of hours for them. So take all the people potentially who are being left behind. In 2019, that's before COVID, so it's a reasonably well-performing labor market at that time. And the number was 15 million. So it's a lot of people.
I mean, just off the top of my head, trying to take out the young and the old and that would probably get labor force participation up to 70, maybe a little bit north of 70%. We haven't seen those numbers in a long time.
We didn't try to calculate that, but you're absolutely right, and you know which group has been falling out of the labor force. It's prime age men. Prime age men are the reason why the labor force participation rate has gone down. Because women, of course, has gone up, and elderly has gone up. People who retired lost their retirement in the global financial crisis, had to go back to work. The US is the only OECD country that is losing prime age men out of the labor force. What are they doing? Well, we have studies on what they do. They watch a lot of TV and they drink a lot. That's what they're doing. It's a huge problem.
I think I've tried, we've gone through and pretty impressively. I congratulate you. In about half an hour, you've gone through the major legs of MMT. Uh, um, would it be accurate to say those things are probably what would be necessary for, if we were to put MMT into practice to work?
People have a misconception. They think that MMT is a proposal. MMT is not a proposal. Okay, we talked about a different interest rate strategy. We talked about the job guarantee. Those are proposals. But the core of MMT, say 90% of MMT, is not a proposal. It's describing the way things work. And the problem is 99% of economists have no idea how the economy works. I mean, literally, they do not understand it. They might know how individual firms work, how individual firms make decisions, but they have no idea how the monetary system works. Literally. I mean, they might even understand how a bank works, but they don't understand the monetary system. What's at the top of the monetary system? The government. It's the US dollar. It's a sovereign currency. They have no idea how sovereign currencies work. And that's why they're so worried about deficits. They're so worried about the government debt because they don't understand how it works. And if you don't understand this, you can't understand the economy. You call for stupid things like, let's balance the budget. Okay, that's a stupid recommendation. Should a firm balance its budget? Okay. Should a household? Yes. The government has to balance the economy. It doesn't balance its budget, it balances the economy. And this gets into the sectoral balance approach. I don't know if you want to go into that, but you need that government's deficit in order for the non-government sector to run a surplus. That's how we save. It's because the government spends more than it receives in taxes. We spend less than our income. We get to run a surplus if the government runs a deficit.
I'm trying to actually get my mind about that, around that. The Why is it that the government must run a deficit if the private sector runs a surplus? And in sort of a simple way, could you explain that?
Very easy. So just for a second, let's pretend that we are in 1968. We can completely ignore the rest of the world. We're a closed economy. Okay. US didn't import much, we didn't export much. Relative to the size of our economy, the rest of the world was irrelevant. That's not true today. But in 1968, at the aggregate level of the economy as a whole, for every dollar spent, there is a dollar of income. Has to be true. It didn't go to Mars. Okay, it stayed here on planet Earth in the United States. Spending has to equal income at the aggregate level. This is the first thing you learn in macroeconomics when you're a freshman in college. Spending equals income. GDP, which is the measure of the output, equals gross national income. Spending equals income. Now we've got two sectors. We've got the government, and for government, we'll include state and local governments. They are big, but they don't matter much because they balance their budgets. They must balance their budgets. The credit rating agencies will jump all over them if they run deficits. Okay, so the federal government dominates. It's bigger and it can run a deficit. Okay, and then the private sector, which is households and firms taken together. If spending equals income at the aggregate level, If the government balances its budget, that means the private sector must be balancing its budget too. Okay? Which means no net saving. I might save, but that's only because you didn't. You spent more than your income. All right. Now, what if the government runs a deficit? It spends more than it takes in taxes. By identity, that means we saved. What form did we save in? Claims on the government, either currency, which mostly will take the form of central bank reserves, or bonds. The government's deficit by identity equals our surplus. Has to. This isn't a theory, it's an identity. Now let's open it. 2025. Now the rest of the world matters a lot. Every one of your listeners knows that we run a deficit against the rest of the world. So there's a third balance. Our third balance is with the rest of the world. We run a big deficit with the rest of the world. This is why Trump is putting taxes on imports to try to reduce that. Okay, now the rest of the world is running a surplus against us. We have a deficit against them. They have a surplus against us. And our household and firm sector is running a surplus. Add those two things together. The foreign deficit, when our economy does well, we go up to a deficit of about 4% of GDP. Our household and firm sector taken as a whole runs a surplus, about 4% of GDP. 4 plus 4 is 8. The government deficit has to be 8. Has to. Okay. And so I could show you a plot, which will show you that the plot around zero, the government is always below the red line. It's running a deficit. The domestic private sector and the foreign sector is always above the line. They're always running surpluses. And they are exactly equal. Whenever the top one dips down, the bottom one goes up. Okay, it's an identity. Must be true. So anyone who tells you the federal government has to balance its budget is also telling you that either we have to eliminate our trade deficit and go into a surplus against the rest of the world, which is not going to happen in your lifetime, okay? Or our private sector has to go extremely deeply into debt because they're going to have to run a deficit to offset the government's balanced budget plus our foreign sector deficit. We did that during Clinton. That's what killed the economy. That was the only time since 1929 that our private sector ran a deficit was during the Clinton years. And we crashed into the global financial crisis. Why? Because the private sector got too heavily indebted and they stopped spending or they were cut off from credit.
Now, right now, and a related question. Let's say we were to target, I guess we would target inflation instead of targeting a deficit because we buy so much from the rest of the world. And unless everybody gets an MMT conversion, they see let's say the United States goes to MMT and we target inflation instead of targeting deficits. And that makes us hit the keystrokes a lot more often, or and will other countries say, you know what, I used to sell you this brilliant 80-inch TV for $800. Well, you're being, in our view, irresponsible with all your keystrokes. We want $1,600 for that beautiful 80-inch TV. That seems like it could happen. Or other countries might say, wait a minute, you're changing your structure, and there's a lot more money in circulation. Therefore, we're going to ask a lot more of you. Is that a reasonable way to think?
I don't think so. I think that if Uh, we were growing faster. The rest of the world would celebrate because they're going to be able to sell more stuff. And the rest of the world is competitive with each other. Vietnam is competing with China. They're going to compete. And look, you said, for much of your life, your adult life, we've been near zero inflation.
Yes.
Japan has been below zero, right? Deflation. Even Europe had very low inflation, the Eurozone. Okay? Our problem was not inflation. Our problem was that we were growing too slowly. Okay. And the reason why we aren't likely to get inflation if we grew a bit faster is because of all the capacity that's been built up around the world. Things changed. Our low inflation had nothing to do with the Fed. It had nothing to do with central banks. They loved to take the credit. They still believe they did it, but it's not true. Okay, if you look at their targets, they couldn't even meet their targets. They went to zero interest rates. They still couldn't meet their inflation target because it was too low. They're trying to get it up with zero interest rates, with trillions and trillions of dollars of nonsense called quantitative easing, which did nothing, but they thought it might do something. They were doing everything they could to try to get the inflation rate up. They could not do it. Why? India, China, Vietnam. You can't get inflation.
They're
Yeah.
exporting deflation because, I remember when was in college and probably about the same time you're in college. The first computer Macintosh was $2,200. My computer now, which is much more powerful, a quarter of that. So in terms of goods, certainly, I'd say services might be different. In terms of goods, you could argue that we have not had inflation if you count, certainly if you count the quality of the things that has been received. Related question. So currently our debt to GDP is about 100%. Um, would that be a problem if it were to go to 300%?
Well, Japan's on the way to 300%. Okay, what is a high debt ratio supposed to do? It's supposed to cause inflation. Does Japan have an inflation problem? It's supposed to cause high interest rates. Does Japan have a high interest rate problem? No, it doesn't have those impacts. Okay.
I would argue though Japan is unusual. Well, they're unusual in many ways, but one of their I think about 90 or 90+% of their government debt is held either internally or by the Bank of Japan in sort of roughly equal pieces, whereas U.S. debt is I think it's probably 50 to 60% held overseas.
No, it's about a quarter, but it goes up and down.
Mm.
Okay. It goes up and down. But yes, it's bigger than Japan's external holding. But why is that? The dollar is the international reserve currency. The rest of the world wants the dollar. That's why they sell us their stuff. And we've been willing to buy it. Okay. Japan is an exporter. The world does not need Japanese yen. Japan exports, and Japan receives dollars for that. So Japan for a long time was the biggest holder of US government bonds, external holder. And then China replaced them. Why did China replace them? Because China replaced Japan as the biggest exporter to the United States.
They've sold us all this stuff. They have all these dollars, right?
So all of those bonds you're talking about that are being held, you know where they're held? They're held by the countries with which we have the biggest bilateral trade deficit. So they end up with bonds. The only other significant holders are offshore banking centers. That's where all the dollar bonds are. They all want the dollar bonds. Okay. The minute China decides they don't want dollar bonds, they will stop exporting to us. They'll say, no, we're going to keep all of our output for ourselves. We're going to let our own people enjoy all the output we can produce. We're not going to sell any to you. We don't want any more dollars.
Could they, in fact, sell things to us and instead of holding dollar assets, which return something nice and is essentially risk free, could they immediately take their dollars and sell the dollars and into their own currency or into the euro or whatever other currency? Could they immediately sell all the dollars that they receive and therefore they don't have to hold any dollars despite selling us stuff?
Well, China has reduced its portfolio bonds. And yeah, the rest of the world wants the bonds, so they have no trouble selling them. If China decides to gradually sell up, they're not going to do it all at once because they don't want to crash the dollar, right?
Right.
Uh, because then they lose. So they're going to feed them into the global bond markets gradually. What does that mean? Our government won't be able to run deficits? No. What it means is there could be some downward pressure on the dollar. What would that do? Well, that would make the US more competitive. That would allow Trump to achieve part of his goal, which is we should export more and import less. It could be good for US manufacturing. So you can see that there could possibly be some good impacts of a depreciation of the dollar. Maybe the dollar is overvalued because the rest of the world right now wants to hold too many of the dollars. It wouldn't hurt for the dollar to come down a bit.
A few more questions. One is, if you run a policy of modern money theory, you target inflation and you're using the keystrokes, and you realize that inflation is now starting to move above where you are comfortable. How would you tamp down inflation? Typically, it's been, the Volcker way was very, very high interest rates. But according to modern money theory, how would you tamp down inflation?
Now, raising interest rates is more likely to boost inflation, not lower it. So we definitely would not do that. We don't want to raise interest rates when you have inflation. So keep them low. That keeps government service of the debt low because you raise interest rates, suddenly the government has to pay more interest. So you're increasing uh, income to all the bondholders. You don't want to increase their income.
Is that why high interest rates would create inflation, because you're putting more money into people who hold savings accounts?
It's one of the avenues. When I'm in a room full of 30 economists and I ask them, what happens if wages go up? Prices go up, 100% approval. What happens if the price of energy goes up? 100% say inflation. What happens if rents go up? Inflation. What happens if interest rates go up? Deflation. Interest is a major cost of doing business. It gets passed along in the same way that gasoline prices get passed along. It makes no sense. Okay. So there's, in addition to the income channel, there's the cost channel. And then also there's the impact on the supply side of the economy. So Powell started raising rates. So we go above 4%. What did that do? It killed housing construction. And we had a massive housing shortage already left over from the global financial crisis. We had almost no houses built for a decade. We have homelessness skyrocketing. We have people with jobs who can't afford rent and they live in their car because rents are too high. We need massive house building across the United States, well, targeted to some areas. Um, and so we raise interest rates and kill the construction sector. That's what we did.
So before we
Crazy.
get too far into that, how under MMT, how would you tamp down on inflation if it looked like it was going to become a problem?
Well, I think that what we did was the right thing. we left our borders open to Chinese output, Indian output. That is what killed our inflation. It had nothing to do with the Fed. It had nothing to do with domestic policy. We imported goods that helped keep inflation down. Uh, Now, we've done some things that help. So Biden had Build Back Better, and solar power and wind power have made a difference. Okay, so energy is one of our bright spots. Of course, the U.S. also started producing a lot more oil. So the thing that is keeping inflation down now is energy costs. If you really want to reduce the cost of living, the most important thing we could possibly do is Medicare for all. We would cut medical expenses in half. Okay. Suddenly, your paycheck is going to go a lot farther. Suddenly, it's cheaper to hire employees. That would be probably the best anti-inflation policy we could have is get insurance out of the healthcare sector. That would do it.
There's a lot to be said for that, and if you could solve that, that would be almost solve. You would solve like a third rail of American politics. Um, would it be?
Let me add one.
Sure, go ahead.
So, because a typical answer people expect us to give, if there's inflation, then what do? Wouldn't you want to raise taxes? Okay, and then they will say, you know how hard it is to raise taxes, and how long it takes. And so we say no. Uh, what you want is a progressive income tax, which we have. Okay, I would like it to be more progressive than it is, but we've got it. And if you watch what happens to tax revenue over the course of the business cycle, and I've done it and I've plotted it, uh, the swing of federal government tax revenue is tremendous. We don't need to raise the tax rates. When we are booming, tax revenue starts growing at 25% per year. When we collapse, when we went into the global financial crisis, it fell at a rate of 40% per year. That's why the deficit goes up. It's not the spending, it's the taxes. Okay. When we are sluggish, the deficit grows not because Congress chose to spend more, it's because tax revenue literally collapses. So our tax system is already correct. It already does what it's supposed to do. We don't need to raise taxes. Uh, Possibly we could look at the spending side, but that doesn't really fluctuate very much over the course of the cycle. It used to fluctuate more before Clinton ended welfare. But since Clinton, the welfare spending does not go up much in a recession.
So, but let's say we were to get inflation under MMT policy or framework. How would you tamp down on that? Saying, you know what, we're happy with it at, pick a number, 7%, high single digits. It's at 10 and looks like it's heading to 12. We need to cool things a little bit. How would you do that?
I don't see that as a plausible scenario. If we implement all the things that we have mentioned, and the most important one is the job guarantee. The job guarantee is going to stabilize wages, and wages are the most important, but there are other important contributors to inflation. But you stabilize wages, you can't get the wage price spiral. So that's what a job guarantee does. That's why it's part of our platform. It is the price stabilizer.
Right. Makes sense. Well, Dr. Ray, thank you so much for spending so much time with us, giving us a really good understanding of MMT. I may at some stage want to come back and have a follow-up because there's some things that we want to drill into, but certainly we don't get a very good understanding out of the snippets that we get in the papers, and it makes it and this makes it sound a lot more reasonable and thought-provoking than it otherwise would be. So thank you so much once again.
Okay, thank you.